So welcome back for the afternoon, and I'm going to quickly reintroduce Dr. Devra Davis. I think most of you were here for the morning, and also I would like to introduce Nadia, who I know very well, and I love her pants. Nadia, what's your last name? Why, Nadia, why? Dr. Devra Davis, who you met this morning, has been working in the scientific field for 40 years as an epidemiologist, as a researcher, and as a writer. And she has revealed many things about the environmental link to human health. And so we're going to continue in that vein. I do want to say one more time that Devra has 3 books for sale out here, and they're all phenomenal, as does Rick Bass, our own local author, almost local, who wrote The Heart of the Monster. Okay, is this better? Some people are covering their ears. Yikes. But I do also want to say that when we were planning this conference, it was Rick Bass who said, you must represent Libby, and I'm so glad that he did. And we have had these brilliant people from Libby who have been fighting the fight in Libby for many, many, many years. And we're going to look at our part in that fight, our part in the Libby situation, and again to learn from Libby how we are living Libby right now. Nadia White was very involved. She's a journalist, a professor of journalism at the University of Montana. She and her students followed very closely the Grace Company lawsuits, that trial that was held. She got to know very well Gaybeth. She will be introducing everyone. We have an incredible panel. I got to meet them last night at dinner, and I was so humbled by each one of them. And so now we're going to turn it over to Dr. Devra Davis, who is going to start this part of the session, which is looking at Libby and our toxic exposure. Thanks.
Thank you again, Georgia, and thank you to all of you for your spending what is a beautiful day here as we work to see that we leave the world better for our children and our grandchildren. I just wanted to share with you this half a minute. This is what I'm about to show you takes a half a minute. And I'd like you to share it with all of those whose brains and bodies you care about. It can be found on our website, and what it is it's a YouTube video that in a half a minute explains to your teenagers and your young children why they have to be careful in protecting their brain. And it starts with this footage of the Wyoming State ski champion as she goes downhill in her state winning race last year.
That's me, Serena Scott. When I ski or ride my bike, I always wear my helmet. Whenever I talk on my cell phone, I use speakerphone or a headset for the same reason, to protect my brain. Cell phones really are small microwave radios. Young adults' brains are still developing and are much more susceptible to radiation. I'm not going to stop using my cell phone, but I want to use it safely so that nothing gets in the way of my fun. Oh, I'll text them back.
And if you go to our website and Disconnect Book, you can find this video. You can find a lot more information that will help you and that you can share with others. And now I want to take a minute and show you my hometown of Donora, Pennsylvania. This is some footage that was developed on public television, and this is available for as a teaching device. There are actually a number of documentary films about the Donora killer smog of 1948. And as I indicated this morning, Donora was a small town around the bend of the Monongahela River where inversions of air pollution were common. And people finally understood the lethal impact of air pollution when 20 people dropped dead in this town. I'm just going to take you through brief excerpts of this video.
People became aware that there were a lot of people dying.
and it was unfortunately a recipe for a disaster.
Let's go to press. Denora, Pennsylvania. Health officials now fear an ammonia epidemic in Denora, where the death toll from a smothering fog has reached 20.
It was the fall of 1948 when that deadly smog descended on Denora. Toxic fumes from a zinc plant and other nearby mills hung over the area for 5 days. When rain finally cleared the air, 20 people had died. Thousands more were sickened.
That just gives you the context of what happened there. In fact, my mother insisted on making that movie, although she had just been diagnosed with the stomach cancer that would kill her. And I think it's important for us to see what it was like, to understand what people accepted, and to recognize in the case of Denora, the town council had 9 people on it, and 7 of them worked for the mill. And when the first reports emerged that there could be anything wrong from the mill that would affect people's health problems, the people who raised those concerns were ridiculed and treated very badly by the people in the town. And I'm sure we'll hear that some of the people in Libby, Montana, still have scars to show for that. But now the town has a museum that I've helped to start that says air pollution started here. Air pollution control started here. Now there's a recognition that Denora made history around the world. And I think Libby, Montana, there will be a museum there someday. And you might want to start to think about it now as a lesson to the rest of the world of what not to do, because we must learn from these experiences so that we don't repeat them again. And I think that in the interest of time, really, I just will share with you that, as I told you this morning, when I first heard that a town called Denora could be polluted, I thought there must have been another town with the same name as mine, because I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that the things that I took for granted, the fact that the sun didn't shine for days at a time, the fact that we'd be covered with soot, that there was anything really wrong with that. And of course, I've spent my life now working on documenting the ways that the environment shapes our life, our death, even the sex and our ability to have children. So I wanted to just share these brief things with you and to let you all know that the Weather Channel did a detailed reconstruction of the Denora killer smog, and that is available with a study guide for people, that there are several different documentaries on the Denora killer smog as well. And I'm looking forward to working with you as we develop educational materials on the environment and health that will spread the message much more broadly, that we can do things now to see that the world looks better in the future. And I think at this point, given the interest of time, and I want to hear from this panel as well, please understand, I'm a little tired. It's been a long set of days, so I'm going to stand in the back and listen. But I really want to thank all of you for making the commitment, for voting with your feet, for being here now. There's a Kenyan proverb I want to share with you. It says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I think we must go together on these issues and recognize that the problems that we face are complicated. They require all of us to do what we can do, each of us, together, because together we will, in fact, go far. Thank you very much.
It is absolutely terrific for all of you to still be here after lunch, after such a fantastic meal. It is wonderful to be here with this panel of people. The story of Libby, to some people who have been thinking about it for 10 years, might feel like they've been, like you know it. Every time I teach environmental journalism at the School of Journalism at the university here, I have to remind myself there are stories much older than Libby's that my students have never heard. The story of Libby, our panel will show us today and talk about it, is still unfolding. we don't know it because it hasn't yet been told in its entirety. And I think it's going to take us certainly 40 more years to begin to know where this story goes. But we're beginning to shape the perspectives that we through which we understand it at this point. And that's what this just terrific panel, I hope, will walk us through the story of Libby as we know it now, and how we can look ahead to it in ways that will help other communities, that can help us begin to think about the lessons that are emerging from Libby. I don't think we really know these lessons in our hearts quite yet. We talk about them, and that's part of learning them, but I think the lessons are continuing to emerge. And I hope that this panel and that this gathering today can put our minds towards the future of understanding what happened in Libby in order to both understand what has happened elsewhere and to help other communities know how to hear and tell the stories of an industrial, slow-moving industrial disaster. For that's what Libby ultimately has come to embody and personify. Our panel today, we're going to go in this order. I didn't even bring my notes. Can I wing it? I can wing it. Gayla Benefield will lead off and share the perspective, share the history of Libby's slow-moving industrial disaster from the perspective of someone who grew up in Libby, who has lost both of her parents to a contamination-related disease, and has, I think it is safe to say, dozens of family members who have been diagnosed with asbestos-related disease. In fact, the number, I always want to say 44 family members. Do you have 44 family members? Yeah. It's shocking how pervasive the impact of the industrial contamination on Libby and on families like Gayla's have been. Gayla can share and will share with us both the personal impacts and her life as the community member who stood up and blew the whistle on both W.R. Grace and Libby's complicit reaction to its industrial contamination. Gayla's story is unique, it's bravely told, and I'm thrilled that she's here to share it with all of us. Tanis Hernandez comes to us from the CARD Clinic, which is the Center for Asbestos-Related Disease in Libby. Tanis is a trained social worker and has been there for about 10 years now. Is that right? 8 years. The story of Libby, as it was broadly and publicly told, began being told in 1999 when the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and local papers, in kind of a convergence, started telling these stories out loud. But it was largely the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and a reporter named Andrew Schneider who brought the facts together to tell the story that caught the attention of federal regulators in a way that lone voices like Gayla's were unable to do. He was an amplification that was essential. And that was 1999. So Tanis arrived on the scene a few years after that as a social worker whose job has emerged. It's a fascinating job, and we're so lucky to have Tanis here to talk about how does a community get its head around living life with a toxic exposure. And the thing that makes Libby, I would love to think it was unique, but very distinctive, is the degree of non-occupational exposure to asbestos. It isn't just that people who worked with asbestos-laced soils at the mine or in the timber yards were affected by it, but they brought it home to their families, and that's part of the story. That's part of the sadness of Libby, is that people who made intentional decisions to avoid this contamination got sick anyway, and their families got exposed. And it is dealing with that on a social level, on a community level, that keeps Tanis busy working at the CARD Clinic every day. She's a terrific perspective to look community-wide and to talk about these lessons of how does a community get its head communally around a contamination of this scale. Dr. Brad Black is also at the Card Clinic and has been in Libby for several decades. I want to say 71? Is that when you got there? 77. Working first as a community physician, not involved particularly in asbestos-related disease, but he has stayed put, he has learned and grown and become a point man for the world's asbestos research. As the world comes to look to understand what happened in Libby and what asbestos does to an individual, they're turning to Libby as a petri dish. It is the gift that the people of Libby, perhaps unwillingly, are giving to the rest of the world is more information about this disease. And Dr. Black is leading the way in helping the research both locally and specifically. He is dealing both with the individuals and with these research teams, so I hope he's going to cover both of those. So we've got a community perspective, we've got a social perspective, and a physical perspective here today. And I'm not going to take any more time because it is just such a well-integrated story that you're going to hear. But I'd like you to think about this in terms of what can the world take away from understanding the story of Libby that is still unfolding. The story of Libby is not done being told, and it is not done being understood. If you're just hearing it for the first time, you are not getting there too late to understand or to integrate the information into your own worldview about how contamination affects our health, our planet, and our communities in such a very fundamental way. So I'm going to turn it over to Gayla Benefield, who will do a little mic swap here and get a PowerPoint up and running. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm honored to be here, actually. And to tell the story of Libby. It's been told over and over so many times. But then again, you hear the same situation happen 40 years prior, and it's going to happen again and again and again because of industrial waste. But I'll talk primarily about Libby. And Libby is situated in actually a bowl very similar to what Missoula is. It's a much smaller bowl, but it's a beautiful area. It's the northwest corner of Montana. The population within the city limits is only 2,800 people. The population within our valley or bowl is approximately 9,000 people. 3 miles as the crow flies from Libby, the zonalite mine went into operation in the early 1900s, about 1920, and they discovered vermiculite or slash zonalite at the time. This is a picture of the dry mill up at the zonalite mine. There's my little pointer, and you see this emitting from the top, and it looks like smoke or steam, when in reality it's dust. Within that dust, there was 5,000 pounds of asbestos per day that was released into the atmosphere, simply from that dry mill operating, which was in operation for probably about 35 years. It was finally shut down in 1975. This, again, is a picture of the blasting and how the ore was mined. It was mined in a open pit mine, but they had to drill and blast to get the ore. Now, at the time, from 1962 until 1974, Libby Dam was under construction, and there was approximately 10,000 men in the turnover that worked on that dam at that time. Those men came to Libby and brought their families to live for the long term of the dam. But the problem was the men working on the dam would hear the blast, and this dust cloud would roll over the top of them and drop the asbestos onto them. The majority of the men that I've talked to that simply came to Libby to work construction, to work for Libby Dam, have been diagnosed, as their families. A lot of them have died. All right, zonalite vermiculite. See if this is going to work. All right, it's used as an insulation. It's an additive to concrete. It's in your potting soil. It's that little shiny stuff. And used as monocoat, it's a fireproofing material that's sprayed on steel beams in the World Trade Center, amongst other buildings. But it contained tremolite asbestos, which is a tramp fiber, and it was never regulated. Now, you ask my motivation. In 1972, my father was diagnosed with asbestos-related disease. He had worked at the mine for 19 years at that time. And he had to leave Libby to come to Missoula, be diagnosed and told he had no lungs. He only lived for 18 months. But he was a broken man because the company that he'd loved and he worked for all that time had let him down. No one told him that the dust was going to kill him. And in all reality, the company knew. But in 1985, my mother was diagnosed with the same disease. And that was probably the turning point for me. Prior to that, I had been concerned about worker safety and the workers up there. I'd always been involved with the unions and workers throughout my life. But this was the turning point when my mother was diagnosed, because she was the first one to be diagnosed with secondary exposure disease. She ultimately died in 1996 of the disease. But it isn't an occupational disease, and that's what I discovered in 1985, and that's when I really started trying to get someone to pay some attention to me, and no one would. Every elected official I talked to simply looked the other way. I mean, good grief. W.R. Grace was paying on every ton of ore that was shipped from Libby. They paid to the county and to the state. It was a golden goose. Who was going to worry about a few miners and their families? It's a generational disease, and actually in 3 generations, my family, it's the 3rd generation. My parents both died of it. My husband is diagnosed and currently on oxygen. One of my 5 children has been diagnosed. The other 4 are waiting for the other shoe to drop. But my extended family is 50 people. I have 13 deceased, 33 diagnosed, 4 have lung abnormalities, and only 4 were ever employed by W.R. Grace. And it isn't just my family, it's every family that has lived for 2 or 3 generations in Libby, Montana. When Andy Schneider showed up, it actually was accidental, but he was the reporter who had covered the situation in Woburn, Massachusetts, portrayed in a civil action where W.R. Grace had polluted a town. And so he heard about W.R. Grace and people sick. He zeroed in on Libby. And at that time, I had collected documents for years, and I provided the documents that resulted in the story that literally rocked the foundations of Libby and the rest of the country. But this is a community reaction to the portrayal within the first week. And this was a newspaper editorial. And pay attention to the bottom. Some local residents believe the stories are being fueled by money-hungry lawyers, and others point out that the miners and their dying families didn't complain when they were taking a paycheck from the mine company. At that point, we had 300 people diagnosed in Libby, and this showed up in the newspaper. But mostly there is concern for the sick and dying, concern for the healthy, and concern for the fragile economy of Libby, and that's all we heard. You are ruining our town. We were trying to build a town on tourism. No one will ever come to Libby. It really was an upside-down world. I hadn't expected this reaction. I hadn't expected the hostility when this story broke. But the community, half the community was outraged, and the other half was either sick or had a friend or family member who was ill. My friend Les Gramstad and I, we were ridiculed, we were threatened with lawsuits, we were shunned and mostly ignored, but we simply kept on persevering on this, showing up at every meeting. We didn't hide. But we were labeled as outcasts, whose sole purpose was to destroy the reputation of our town, and to this day there's still people that feel that. And that's really the tragedy, because we didn't do it to the town, it was done to the town. But basically, after all, it was just a bunch of miners and their families, wasn't it? And that's still the logic with some people in Libby. It became a political issue. Grace denied all responsibility. The business community sided with W.R. Grace immediately. The Republican administration offered to assist the businesses. Little help came to the victims. But help started trickling in. But the people were panicked because they'd gone through the screenings that were held in 2001 and 2002, and suddenly they were faced with a disease that they didn't know they had, from an exposure they didn't know they'd gotten, and the only thing they knew about the disease is if somebody got it, they died. The EPA stood very solidly with us, though, and started bringing in all the other agencies to help us. Senator Max Baucus came to the forefront and promised he would do everything in his power to help us, and that is one politician that has absolutely lived up to that pledge to these people in a small town. But acronyms became our second language in Libby. We have EPA, CAG, TAG, ATD, and it goes on and on and on. But now I want to talk about really what I think is the big issue now, because my generation has been diagnosed. We're the petri dish. We'll do all the testing. They can study us until the cows come home. But this is a picture of the Little League baseball field in 1978. Oh, I'm trying to get my pointer. All right, this is W.R. Grace's buildings right here. And this is where the material was brought down from the mine site and left laying in these buildings to be loaded on boxcars, to be shipped out on open rail cars. The whole area was totally contaminated and polluted, but the children played. For 40 years, that Little League ball field was there, and they were there until 1997. They were located next to the expanding plant. W.R. Grace knew, even the city fathers knew, but nobody bothered to move the ball fields. The young adults who played there, I figured it out. They were there for 2 hours a day, 3 times a week, for 8 weeks of the baseball season, and they were being diagnosed in 2002. 5 of the members of the young man there was my son when he was 12. 5 members of his baseball team have been diagnosed. And these are young men who should be in their prime, and instead they're faced with this disease. But then we found out the running track at the high school football field was found to have been built of tailings from the mine site. When the EPA found this mother lode, the contamination had spread to the football equipment, the concession, and even the announcer's booth. This area had been in use for nearly 20 years. But nobody told the EPA that it was there. I had to find the documents and give them to the EPA. They went in and took a backhoe to the running track, and it was like, oh my God. But this is the ultimate tragedy. This is Plummer School. This is one of our 3 elementary schools that we had during the construction of Libby Dam when our population was so high. They built ice skating rinks behind the schools for the children to skate in. This whole area is made from tailings. Most of it was nearly 100% tremolite. Tailings is the garbage after they process the mine. They brought the tailings down, and for 25 years, this was behind this school. The other 2 schools had closed or they'd had them covered up. This one was still in existence 2 years after the EPA showed up. It was a favorite playing place for the children to go out and play because they could run, they could fall in. It was just little tiny rocks. I mean, it was just fun. The latency period for hundreds of children began on the first day of kindergarten through their 5th grade. This is our future. This is the problem. And I'm sure Dr. Black is very well aware of that. We have children who are 18 and 19 and 20 years old who are playing in that area. But what was contaminated in Libby, the football equipment, the football field, the running track, the track equipment, baseball, the Little League, through Babe Ruth equipment and the baseball concession. How long these children had been playing with this contaminated equipment is anyone's guess. But life goes on. W.R. Grace declared bankruptcy in 2002. Criminal charges were filed against W.R. Grace by the federal government. We went to trial. It was a farce. We lost. They won, but did they really? This is something my daughter wrote in 2000, and I feel it very appropriate to read you because it doesn't talk about Grace so much as every corporation that's done this. Small town folk have strong ideals. Love your job, it provides the meals. Listen to the man, he's from the city. Hug the executioner, ain't it a pity? Piles of dust lying on the ground, piles of dust floating around. Children in the dust playing kids' games. Hug the executioner, ain't it a shame? The jobs are gone, the bosses are gone, the money's all gone, but the dust holds on. Holds on to the gardens, holds on to the town, holds on to the lungs, people going down. People dying young and old, dust in their lungs, nobody told. Now the people talk between dry coughs. Damn the executioner, the dust is killing us off. I'm done.
And I'm going to try to leave a half an hour after everyone's spoken for Q&A, and at that point I'll have you really direct questions to individual panelists, which I think always helps. So Tanis, I'll just have you take it away.
Well, can you hear me okay? Well, I wanted to thank you all for taking this opportunity to ask me to talk today. I was told that we were looking for lessons learned in Libby, which gave me a real personal opportunity to reflect on how far our community has come in the past 10 years in addressing the environmental and public health disaster that we experienced. As we all know, in many elements of life, people's perceptions and beliefs shape their reality. This is especially true when things are not glaringly obvious, especially when they're not perceivable by any of the five senses, such as our toxic exposure was. Sometimes people's perceptions can be more true than the facts that they are presented with. In today's media, sudden disasters get the most attention. We're all very aware of the Gulf oil spill, the Katrina disaster, or what happened at 9/11. Slow motion environmental disasters are much harder for people to recognize. In Libby, we had a slow, subtle, diluted onset that occurred for decades, which meant there was no warning. There was no sudden glaring evidence that called people to action to respond to the adversities we were confronting. Without an obvious presentation of the disaster, when it's diluted and ambiguous, it is easy to deny that a disaster or a public health threat is even occurring. And we all have to admit that denial is a very safe place to be, and it's easy to remain there when there's no obvious evidence of the disaster. The problem with that is it leads to avoidance of the issue. So how do slow motion environmental and public health disasters get recognized? The first thing you've got to have is that passionate, dedicated group of advocates to get the issue recognized. We wouldn't be where we are today without the efforts of Gala and Les and many others that they worked with. Once a disaster is recognized, you got to start building momentum by widening the circle of support from credible sources. It's also important to remember that in this type of disaster that's not overtly obvious, information itself is the disaster to many people. As they start to try to wrap their brain around the unknowns about the details of what actually happened, the impacts, and the future implications, it can all become baffling and overwhelming to many. As new information is learned and we learn about the long-lasting impacts into the future across generations, the disaster just continued to magnify. Of course, this leads people into a whirlwind of emotion. They feel betrayed by the responsible party, knowing that they had this information from the beginning. This shatters people's ability to trust other people, to trust their past assumptions about the world, and can even damage people's worldview. It's hard to trust an agency coming to town who wants to help after it is disclosed that they knew for decades that this was a risk. There's a feeling of loss of control over the present and future. There's nothing we can do now. The exposure had occurred for 70 years. Of course, that leads to great anger over the loss of security and safety in the community. People needed an outlet. It's not like a flood where you come together as a community and stack sandbags or help your neighbors evacuate from a forest fire. People had nothing tangible to do. And so it became important to provide a constructive opportunity for people to get involved and impact the situation. The first thing you need to develop you need a unified voice. As Gayla said, there were various factions around the community who believed the disaster to varying degrees, that it was even occurring. So the first step in getting that unified voice is to understand the issue. Today, people in Libby know more about the details of the mineralogical fiber elements, the unique health risks, the details of methodology of risk assessment related to the Libby amphibole asbestos. Once we started to understand the issue in more depth, the Libby community as a whole finally could come together and recognize that there were 3 goals that everybody could agree upon. We wanted a clean environment. We wanted screening and health care for the affected population. And we wanted an economic and community image revitalization after the media surge that exposed the issue. Once we knew what our goals were, it was time to start focusing on the solutions to pursue those goals. Once you know what your solutions are, people need to learn how to talk about it. You know, we were a working class town, and many people felt intimidated to speak out and to articulate the solutions we were pursuing. So once we knew our solutions and what we wanted to get in place, we had to start building momentum one piece at a time. This is kind of reinforced by the structure of funding in our world. Each new program came from a different pot of money. And so we kind of ended up with this patchwork response to meet our immediate needs. Gayla talked about alphabet soup, and I think her reference was in regards to the agencies, ATSDR, EPA, HHS. Well, we added onto that, and the community created all of these acronyms. Each acronym stands for a healthcare program, a community group to provide case management, so we had all these different organizations, different grants, different appropriations, pots of money that kind of patched work together all the needs to try to address the issue in the community. Over time, we realized that we needed to develop an ongoing infrastructure to last for the long term because the disaster impacts that had unfolded and now we were aware of, we knew they would go into the future for many more decades. You see CARD in the middle of that list. Everything below CARD is a health care program or benefit that has now folded into CARD, so people have one place to go to have their health care issues met. The CARD Clinic is a nonprofit specialty holistic health care clinic run by a community-based volunteer board of directors. CARD initially started as a place to interpret screening results and provide asbestos-related disease health care. But it was quickly recognized that this was a multifaceted array of needs to be addressed, not just a health issue. This is when I was brought on to CARD to help people start to deal with the psychological and social impacts of the disaster. We also began to play an advocacy role. A lot of the programs that were acronymed before, we had to go out and solicit funding or support or write grants to try to fill these different gaps in the needs of the community. All in all, CARD became a community home for the asbestos health issues, a place people could go, a place they could trust. The company had a voluntary medical plan that was a great public relations piece, but left people often without essential care that they thought would be covered. And so this created a lot of confusion, a lot of mistrust about any new program that was developed. And CARD became the place where you could call, why am I getting this survey in the mail? Is this a safe person to respond to? Is this benefit programs for real, or is it by W.R. Grace? We even got lots of legal questions, even though that's by no means in our realm. But it was a safe place for people to go to ask their questions, where we could help them act, basically make referrals to other resources to help them address their needs. CARD also has become a vehicle to organize the community regarding ongoing asbestos health issues. We quickly recognized that if you want your voice to be heard, even if it's a united voice, you can't do it alone. Of course, the critical first step is to have the support of the affected population and your local community. But then you need to go beyond. The CARD Clinic over the years has developed relationships with several prestigious universities, looking at the unique health effects associated with this fiber that Dr. Black will talk about more in a few minutes, as well as the unique psychosocial implications. A slow motion disaster creates a very different experience than the sudden disasters that the world is more used to dealing with. The psychological and social problems are much more pervasive, evolving, throughout people's lifetimes, across generations. We also built strong relationships with our political leaders and our agencies. We wouldn't be where we are today without their support and involvement. When we talk about political leaders, it's important to have support on all levels. Across political parties, our county commissioners are all united, same voice that the community portrays, as well as our state officials and, of course, our federal, national leaders who have stepped up so much. With a disaster that occurred for 70 years and took years or even decades to be recognized and dealt with, of course, the disaster impacts don't suddenly end. And that is why the long-term development of infrastructure and widespread support is so important. One thing about the slow motion disaster is you have these multiple timelines. What Gayla's family experienced before the disaster was recognized, many people who might have been in that denial that a disaster was even there are now suddenly becoming ill themselves. One of the most profound examples to me was a patient we had who was in the denial camp, the business community. He was a realtor. Was devastated by the impacts that this attention had drawn, but now he's becoming ill. And what a change for each individual to have to change their whole paradigm of thought now that they are experiencing the public health effects. So although our community has, we don't go through this together like the 9/11 disaster. Everyone went through it on the same timeline. And so often it can be a lonely individual journey for those people who suddenly now are facing the issues. The other big thing is that Gayla talked about the childhood exposures. The demographics at CARD that I've seen over the last 8 years, it's shifting. Before it was minors, their spouses. Now we're getting those kids who are exposed in childhood. And so we're getting younger and younger as a population, which is a scary shift to see. They're not people retired who are on Medicare and have access to health care. There are people in their 50s or 40s who are now trying to raise families. Their disease is interfering with their ability to function, to their financial stability. Of course, there's a lot of relationship issues, from caring for your elderly parents who have ARD to struggling with your own daily life, knowing what lies ahead for you. While you also have your children at home that you're trying to maintain an active parental role in their life, knowing they were exposed, fearing for their future. I think helping Dr. Black and I, every week we help these people deal with their physical health struggles, their emotional struggles, and their social struggles. And I think that's what keeps us going all these years. The passion and belief in what you do sustains you, because solutions must be sustained over time. You need to work on multiple levels for action. So on one hand, we're working with our local leaders, our state leaders for short-term solutions. We have received two-year appropriations from the state of Montana legislature, which we lobbied for. We would drive 5+ hours to Helena. After the clinic closed, we'd drive to Helena, lobby for funding, and then be back the next day to care for patients again. Helping patients learn how to use their voice, learning them to speak out about, the solutions we needed. So while we're working on this short-term solution, we also had to think long-term. We didn't want to live forever going from 2-year pots of money, hoping you could get the next pot of money, or we were out of healthcare dollars. And so at the same time, we worked with our federal legislatures to look at long-term solutions. The other key thing is that team is essential. Of course, you're going to have times where you get disheartened or discouraged. It's only to be expected in a long battle. But that's when you rely on your team members to pick you up, give you the pep talk, and help you carry on. It's also good to utilize your expertise. Dr. Black and I have very different skills and assets, as well as many other members on the team, and that allows us to complement each other. Do what you're best at and know when to pass it off to someone who might have a stronger skill in one area. It's also important to focus on the positives and celebrate your successes. Every new appropriation we got to patch us along 2 years was a cause for huge celebration. It's always important to increase awareness and to continue to expand your circle of support. You can make it fun. This is our Research Rally Carnival, where we pulled together a mixture of expert academic researchers from around the country to meet the community people. Our community is so excited about research. It's amazing. We don't feel like we're in a petri dish. We feel like we're partners in leading a research effort to better understand this disease that will hopefully benefit people across the nation. Every person who comes to CARD, we ask them, would you like to participate in research? It's an informed consent process. We have a 94% positive response rate. So when you're working to address a slow motion environmental disaster, even when you're making considerable progress, in order to sustain yourself over the long haul, let you be an affected individual, a community activist, or an active participant in building long-term infrastructure and programs, you gotta strike a balance. You need to remember to take care of yourself and learn to live in spite of the challenges life presents you. Sometimes When we are extremely passionate about something, it's hard to turn it off. And it's okay to turn it off sometimes. To make it a priority to have a little time away from the issue. My husband had to impose a curfew on me. I'm not allowed to work past 6 o'clock at night because you feel like you have so much to do and so much is important that it's hard to disengage once in a while. And so we rely on those around us to help us to take a break. It allows us to think clearly, come back rested and rejuvenated. It's important to remember the rest of your life, that it's okay to keep that balance because we're 8 years in and we have many years to go. Never underestimate the power of determination. Based on the relationships that our community has developed and maintained with our elected officials, our federal senators have demonstrated their unwavering dedication to the affected population. Through the Affordable Care Act that was passed last March, a long-term solution for continued screening and health care was made available to sites declared a public health emergency like Libby. This could have far-reaching positive implications for other communities with environmental health hazards. Currently, there are situations such as the communities in southern Utah and on the Navajo Reservation who are dealing with the aftermath of the uranium mining. But despite this great success, the work still isn't done. Often with legislation, we hear that the devil is in the details. So it is important to follow through to be certain that the policies and programs that develop meet the goals that they were intended to address. And it certainly takes vigilance to make sure that happens, as we are experiencing now. In addition, the work goes on as we continue to work with the affected population, those who are exposed and not yet diagnosed, those who are diagnosed, and those who are severely ill. We continue to make sure they have the health care and support that they need to maintain their quality of life as they continue their journeys. Thank you.
So thanks, Dennis. We're going to roll on to Dr. Black.
Hello, thank you for the invitation to be here. I am Brad Black. I've been a physician in the practice of medicine starting in 1977 in Libby. And I've shown you some pictures of the beauty because that was a very strong drawing card for me, who was an outdoor person and was very much looking forward to spending my time hiking and just always reflect back on this beautiful village in the Kootenai Valley. As you can see, the setting here, certainly the hillsides there are fully green with our particular situation. But I was always drawn also to the very clean and renewable resource industry, and young people in Libby started out early working very hard. And they really were productive. Along with this, of course, was this vermiculite mine, which I had very little knowledge of, but I knew that it was a very important employer of the area when I moved to the community. But here was the real drawing card, was the opportunity to advance my fly fishing skills. And a very isolated and beautiful place for a family to grow up. So why don't we go right to it? So with how my life changed, and then many others at the same time. I want to just basically go through my perspective, beginning with the awareness of the potential public health problem brought forth by Andrew Snyder in a series of articles in the Seattle PI in 1999. I first met him earlier in the summer when he was doing some of his investigative work. Little did I know where he was going with it, but he was just a little bit on the abrasive side and asked a few questions. And Devras said something like this earlier, so I can get by with it too. And I said, well, if there was something wrong like that here, I would have seen it. So, wish I'd never said that. Anyway, and then talk about the scope of the Libby amphibole asbestos exposure. And I try to, that's one thing I should correct, is that we hear tremolite, we hear that. Libby's mixture of fibers is very unique, and it's not found anyplace else. And so that's something that may have significant pertinence as we move forward in research. Anyway, how did this escape recognition? This was one of the hardest things I dealt with in the early phases of this, being a provider in the community, and then of course, what is the community response? So the Seattle PI articles come out in 1999, and I finally realized what Andrew Snyder was digging at me for, and this came as a very strong shock to see this come out, that there were asbestos-related lung diseases as a result of environmental exposure. And in addition, that this implicated widespread Libby asbestos exposure in the area, and that this material that was transported to many sites around the country was likewise very contaminated. So I had to do I had to really kind of in my own mind get through some of my own denial. Certainly I didn't want to believe that we missed something like this, and it would be something that would be hard to deal with. And so I went to visit with Dr. Alan Whitehouse, who was a Spokane pulmonologist who followed zone light workers from the 1970s on, along with some Libby patients, whom were having breathing problems, but really didn't, I don't think he really understood why. And he followed these people because he thought something might be wrong, so he kept listening and watching and following. And it was not until the 90s where he started really picking up on what these folks were having trouble with and realized that they were in fact starting to show the radiographic signs of asbestos-related disease. And so even in his pulmonary practice, where he had seen significant cases of asbestosis resulting from the Hanford exposures, where a different type of asbestos fiber was present, he didn't recognize this pattern. It didn't fit with the pattern he was accustomed to seeing. So understanding that, and then right after, and saying, well, in my mind, I was saying, well, look, he showed me the cases he was seeing, and I said, well, Alan, if you're seeing those, I can tell you there's going to be a lot of people that are going to have problems, because I know what people did in this community, including myself. And then, so soon after that, the ATSDR provided the Libby community asbestos screening programs in 2000-2001, where we had approximately 7,200 residents screened, with over 18% of those having X-ray abnormalities that could be caused by asbestos. And taking that, and then also having the opportunity at a latter point of getting a conservative estimate of how many people lived in the Libby area during the life of the mine, and this would be a conservative figure, would be 80,000 people. And if you further extrapolate that to those that lived there after 1950, when the economic activities changed dramatically, the county population doubled after 1950, probably 55,000 or more of those resided after 1950, with construction of the Libby Dam and the W.R. Grace purchase of the zonolite mine and the ramping up of those activities. So we're talking about a fairly sizable population, besides the 9,000 that is listed as the local population. So how did the protectors of the public health at all levels, that includes me, of course, as I saw myself as one of the public protectors, fail the Libby residents? Well, in all honesty, I think that my partner, and whom I started practice with in 1977 in Libby, Richard Irons, was an internist, and we shared a lot together, and he had indicated to me that he had some workers that were showing asbestos disease, and we both looked at each other and said, well, you know, when we were going through medical school, we were not expected to see any more of this disease. Regulation had taken care of those problems. And he was still concerned at that time and made a trip to Cambridge to meet with W.R. Grace officials. He'd been in communication by letter before this, trying to encourage them to help invest in some equipment to better screen our population, not knowing that there was going to be a problem, but just in a proactive way to try to make sure we were protecting workers as well as we could, as well as their family members. And he was concerned about the public at large because he was aware of the poor industrial hygiene. In other words, the workers left work, would go to the bar, go to the chiropractor with their dusty clothing or the emergency room. So, but anyway, as you'll see from the implications from these memos that showed up later on about his trip there, they were clearly had some concerns, and they probably didn't want out. So anyway, they decided to do their own program. So during that same time, our federal agencies had an interest, and I think probably both Rick and I had the feeling that with intense regulatory oversight, surely any exposure risk would be reduced to acceptable levels. So in the 1980s, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health did a worker study. And looking back at those studies, I realized they'd sampled many areas, and including a conveyor which was right at the river. Well, first of all, the ore would be brought down from that site you saw in Gayla's slides. The ore that was already milled was brought down, and it would be put in large bins there to be stored and then to be utilized when orders were made. And this ore was dropped on conveyors when the order was to be sent out, and it would go on a main conveyor, which would then go over the river, over the Kootenai River, across to the railroad tracks on the other side. So anyway, they sampled all this, and there were these very high levels of Libby amphibole, but not even a thought that perhaps all the people fishing under there and the public would not come, no recognition they might come in contact with this. I mean, so there was a disconnect between NIOSH and public health right there. And I don't know if it would have done any good because EPA was aware of the potential risk associated with zonalite installation, but no further action had been taken at that time. So in 1999-2000, we had a very unique group of folks from Region 8 EPA who saw what had happened in Libby, went back and looked at what happened in the 80s and where there might have been failures to do what should have been done back then. And they took a valiant role and a very commendable role of stepping forth and trying to make sure Libby would not be dropped through the cracks again. And we had quite a group working there, including Dr. Aubrey Miller, you see there. Now, this is another interference with really trying to understand what's going on. Physicians with familiar diagnostic differential, I mean, we were pretty well locked into these differential diagnoses of asthma, COPD, or somebody had poor conditioning, they had respiratory infections, or irritants from the outside air. You know, we all know that Libby had similar problems to Missoula in terms of particulates and inversions and those kind of problems. And the chest x-rays were frequently interpreted as normal or just had very nonspecific scarring. And all we knew about asbestos was what we learned in going through medical school in the 70s and 80s. And at that time, environmental exposure to asbestos was unlikely to cause any significant lung disease. Pleural plaques, which are very small areas of scarring of the lung lining caused by asbestos, were mostly considered beauty marks, indicating that there was previous asbestos exposure, but really no other implications. And also that asbestos caused scarring that only affects health when the scarring is seen within the lung on X-ray, not just in the lining. So what has been observed? Well, these small plaques are commonly associated with progressive lung disease. And the chest X-rays do not have the usual appearance of asbestosis, but a very subtle thickening in the lining of the lung, causing difficulty in recognizing this pattern on X-ray. And so on this next one, I kind of want to show you why that's difficult. And I hope this doesn't bother you too much. Does this have, oh, there it does. Any idea what this is? Anyway, a small incision was made in one of our patients because they had problems with fluid buildup, and we had to go, for diagnostic reasons, go in and look inside their chest cavity. This was done through a scope with a very small incision. But this is the lining of the chest wall here. And it should be pink and glistening. It ought to have a very pink and glistening look. And all you see is this dirty white coating that overlies this whole area. And you see that how something's been pulled off. You see that thin layer? That's what all that is, a very thin layer of fibrosis that encases the chest. And that is a very common pattern. But it's also very hard to see on X-ray because it lines the chest cavity and it does not create any very prominent shadow on chest X-rays. So think of it this way. You know, we look at images and we try to associate those with things that are familiar in our head. But what if we don't know something? You know, maybe there's something in there we should know about looking for. You know, but now, look at that. What if we're looking for a clown? Well, there is one right up here, isn't there? And what about a snail? You can kind of see the snail here. A mouse. See the mouse? The eagle. The camel. The wolf. And there's a beggar holding out his cup. So, yeah, so images, you know, can, like I said, if we in the medical world just have familiarity with certain things, and that's what we're looking for on that picture image, it's easy to miss other portions of that image that could be quite important clinically. So, you just got to keep that in mind. The other thing, the additional things that have been observed is the environmental Libby asbestos exposure has caused severe life-ending lung disease. It's associated with rapid progression and associated with very severe chest discomfort. A lot of our exposures happen just like this. This isn't in Libby, but this is export material from Libby in Minneapolis, St. Paul. By the way, these two children, I think, well, I know one was, autopsy was studied and reported on, and the other one I heard had died also from asbestos-related disease in their 40s and 50s. So, but anyway, common pathway of exposure, and I want to relate it. This is a little bit of a story about a good friend that grew up in Libby and played in the ore pile, and just an active person, and moved out of Libby in the early 80s, and then lived in Missoula. But he loved to do everything. He ran, bike, hiked, and fished, and you name it, and just loved people and loved the outdoors. And started having a lot of problems in the early 2000s, 2004, and saw him, and he simply had plaques on his X-ray. Those beauty marks, but it was still, his breathing test hadn't changed much. And this would be an X-ray, and keep this in mind. I know you don't always read X-rays, but there's just like when we call plaques, they're these little white spots up here in the chest. I don't know if you see them from here. Anyway, very minor stuff. A lot of physicians would have read this normal. But in just a few years, you know, he changed, and his lungs became much more were scarred and very restricted. He could hardly take a deep breath because of the severe pain. And it was totally, from 2006 on, very incapacitated. And we just lost him last year from end-stage lung disease. It was at age 56. Simply a youngster that played in it. And we've got more like that are going to have problems like that. And that's been a very difficult one to see. But that's one situation. And then here's the bigger picture. Mortality from asbestosis has been upgraded by NIOSH, and it goes up to 2004. And once again, Lincoln County runs the highest on the age-adjusted death rates per million population. And it's not likely to change for quite a few years. So what do we do? How does the community respond? You know, the thing, at this point, we had to work to restore trust in those that have been harmed or are to be harmed. And the best way to do that was to develop an infrastructure to make sure we took care of people and kept ongoing screening and cancer surveillance and various things to make sure we did the best we could if they had to get ill. Second, also importantly, was to vigorously search for effective therapies through research. And we also had further community response. Tanis has spent hours, along with other staff, to outreach to the community, to educate, to help break down division and promote acceptance of this disease, and of course prevent further exposure. So we are observing something different here. We don't understand why the lung lining is where most of the scarring takes place. We don't know why these people develop such intense chest pain while they scar. We don't know really what the mechanisms are for this rapid progression, for somebody to be running and then within 6-8 years dead from their lung disease. That's not typical of asbestosis. Could there be autoimmune mechanisms involved? We have worked hard. We sponsored a series of research meetings. We wanted to link in with the academic community, with folks that are knowledgeable, with a large amount of understanding of the asbestos-related diseases, establish an advisory group and develop a research agenda. Dr. Jim Lockey at the University of Cincinnati is a pulmonologist, occupational medical doctor, who does have a connection to our Libby population in that he, first of all, his area especially is inhaled fibers and health effects. And that he does his research in that area, but he's also a clinician. He works in the clinic and sees patients also. But he also follows about 400 to 500 patients that worked at the Marysville, Ohio plant. It was the Scott's Company's agricultural business, because they were the largest importer of the Libby vermiculite, and they expanded it there. And so a lot of their workers are sitting in the same position, experiencing the same kind of diseases we're seeing in Libby. So he has a feel for what we are seeing and is very interested to understand why we're seeing what we're seeing. And then there's Steve Levin at Mount Sinai, who's a professor of occupational medicine and heads up the Selikoff Center there. They follow about 3,000 insulators that were exposed to chrysotile asbestos in very heavy levels in their work. And so we're doing some comparative work together through a CDC grant. And it's a 5-year grant, and we're working on that to develop the exposure matrix. We've got Curtis Noonan, who some of you know here, who is helping us with our exposure matrix and is our epidemiologist for our grant. And we're going to compare characteristics of disease progression between the Libby population and the Mount Sinai population. And then focus on childhood exposures and health effects, and then study for presence of autoimmunity. And Dr. Gene Fow, who was at the University of Montana, who's now at Idaho State University, is also working on us with this grant. So anyway, I always guess it's always good to have quotes at the end, and there's a lot of quotes that come out from very bright people. And of course, William Osler was considered the father of clinical medicine. Always said, medicine is a science of uncertainty and an art of probability. The greater the ignorance, the greater the dogmatism. And heavens knows we face dogmatism in our situation, but never shy from challenging the medical dogma. And of course, listen closely to patients. Dr. Whitehouse did, and he found out they usually have the answers. Thank you.
So thanks very much to all of you all. I'm going to follow Georgia's lead on time.
I think we should take a few questions.
Okay, I'd love to. If people have especially specific questions that steer us towards the future, that ask specific questions of these panelists that can help answer this question of how can the rest of the world go to school on what has been so hard learned by Libby. Anybody have a question in the back here?
Plaque that's in the lungs, any relation to a plaque in the brain, Alzheimer's? And then a positive thing, I always wonder, is there any good that we can get from asbestos? Is there a good way, done any study on, is there any value to it other than the good for insulation and evidently good for soil and stuff as far as grown stuff, but is there a way we can eliminate the hazard and, keep people working healthfully?
Well, the plaques we're talking about are in the pleural lining. It's a buildup of scar tissue. That's called a plaque, totally different than what you're envisioning in the brain. Now, the fibers that contaminate the Libby ore are not commercially usable. They just happen to be riders along with the commercial vermiculite product. And so they serve no purpose other than to cause disease. In other words, it's not like the insulators in New York who use cryostyle asbestos. It was well known. It's a flexible fiber that was suitable for making pipe wraps and various forms of blankets where there was need for fire protection. But this fiber in Libby is a contaminant. These are contaminant fibers with no commercial suitability. So it's just unfortunate they were sitting next to the commercial product.
We have our question straight back, and then we'll come far back and then near back.
You all three are heroes, really true heroes. I'm just wondering if there's anything that we can take as we move forward in trying to stop other atrocities, other things that might impact our health in negative ways. What can we take from I guess the legal perspective? You lost the lawsuit. What have you learned from that? What could be done differently next time?
As if I need a microphone. What can be done? I'll tell you what, when we started this, we had 300 people diagnosed with the disease. I had possession of 350 death certificates of former workers, the majority of which that had died from this. We had everything there, but you know what I try to say is the fish don't have to die before you test the water. We were the canaries in the mine. But you need to look at what type of toxins are out there, and you can find out what the ramifications of, say, childhood exposure to these toxins is now. Before this child is exposed, before they're 20 years old and discover a problem. I think this is part of we have to be responsible now. We have to turn around and fight back to everything that's been let loose in our environment. And it isn't that difficult to find out exactly what chemicals and toxins are out there. And if you've got a dump site of some sort near a schoolyard or in a residential neighborhood, have it tested. And remember, I think the biggest thing is people are afraid of them. The EPA, I felt, worked for me. I didn't work for them, and which I reminded every elected official and every government agency that came to Libby is that, no, you work for me, you are working for the people, but you have to be persistent. But remember, the fish don't have to die before you test the water.
I just had a question about what other things are contaminated with asbestos. You know, when I saw that word vermiculite, I thought, I know that word. Where do I know that word from? Was it potting soil that has vermiculite in it? Is it safe to use?
Well, remember there were other sources of vermiculite. Up till 1980, the mine in Libby supplied about 80% of the world's supply. So the chances are high on products that if you bought them before 2000, when they were pulled from the shelves in 2000, if anybody bought vermiculite before that, see, the material hadn't been pulled from the shelves. We did find out even later some was sold on eBay, and I can't remember how much farther after 2000 that was. It seemed like 2004 or 5. Somebody was selling zonolite on eBay, and it got picked up by the EPA. But I'd like to talk about the larger public health concerns, which we have always been frustrated with. Is there's still no real effort to protect workers. This material is in 30 million homes, and we get stories all the time of people that got exposed outside someplace else in their home, the attic, and there's been no effort by NIOSH or otherwise to make sure the workers are aware of this. Once again, I think all around the country there are workers, construction workers, plumbers, electricians, anybody entering spaces where this material exists are going to disturb it. And if they do it repeatedly, they're at risk for developing lung disease. This doesn't take that heavy day in and day out exposure like the insulators in New York did. They worked 20, 30 years in heavy dust every day. This fiber has a relative potency that's different. And working in it for shorter periods of time can cause significant health effects. And so there's still, and that includes the EPA, they're not out there really strongly going after that issue to protect those workers. Potting soils that are on the market now, which would be considered to be safe, and just you can always double check, but just look at the source of where the vermiculite came from. That's what should be on the bags.
Keep it down. When you use it, keep it down. And I want to touch on, finish what you asked about the lawsuit and what could Libby have done to have had a different outcome in the criminal. This was the criminal prosecution of W.R. Grace. There were many civil trials that had a very different trajectory than the criminal trial. Many of those were settled, but very few were pursued to the end and won. And that's what tried a lot of the information out of W.R. Grace was the discovery process in civil cases that provided the material that the Department of Justice used in their criminal prosecution. So this recent trial was very different than the civil trials that preceded it. The civil trials were very important to that. And I'm a journalist, and I watch the legal process sometimes in amazement. And I think the thing you can do is not confuse justice with a lawsuit. I know that lawyers would say that, but really the fact that criminal prosecution failed, it wasn't the end of seeking justice, and it doesn't mean that justice can't be done. It was a lawsuit. It wasn't capital J justice. But the importance of those civil cases that came earlier, I don't think can be underestimated. And what eventually made that criminal prosecution so very difficult was that basically the entire case was compressed by statutes of limitations into a period during which there was no mining activity. So many of the stories you're hearing here could not be entered into evidence in the trial. That's a whole different story. But in a nutshell, don't wait and don't underestimate the importance of those earlier civil cases that were pursued to the end. If they're settled, you never get the documentations out of discovery.
Are you seeing any tremolite asbestosis in the 9/11 workers?
Well, first of all, we call that tremolite. First of all, I will correct that. We call it tremolite, but it isn't. Tremolite makes up about 1%. This is what caused the technicality that allowed W.R. Grace to argue that the judge should eliminate everything before the Clean Air Act in 1990 by saying that Libby's fibers weren't regulated because they're primarily winchite and richterite, which are non-regulated mineral fibers. But, yeah, that's the technicality. So they weren't held accountable for contaminating or causing disease from regulated asbestos. But the question as far as what's the exposure there, I have my thoughts, and Dr. Levin has his thoughts. He's followed the World Trade Center workers. Now, of course, the initial lung disease they got was from the caustic materials that they breathe in the dust there, and it caused a lot of bronchial problems, airway disease, very severe lung disease, and then there were cases of a condition called sarcoidosis. It was way above what it should have been. Of course, it's too soon to know. It's that latency is, we're not going to know for 10, 20 years. Now, that being said, because of the mechanical things that happened with the fall of the towers, there was a pulverization, and these fibers are mechanically friable. That is, and literally they would, it could have been ground into very small fibers, not easily detectable. And we don't know what those are going to do over time. But in the next 20, 30 years, we'll start getting, there'll be some idea about that. But we won't know that for a while.
We're going to do one last question, and this conversation can continue for years to come.
I wanted to know, there are other breathing individuals in the ecosystem besides humans. So what about wildlife, pets? Those are all breathing entities. What happened to them? Or what is happening to them?
It's obviously in the human, we're talking about latencies that are so, how does that swing back on animals? What kind of latency do they need before they develop disease? Nobody knows that really. Yeah. Dog years.
Dogs and cats, pets, horses?
Yeah.
The trick is that if there is such a long latency period, then those animals don't live long enough to exhibit the symptoms. My students were fascinated with the idea that grizzly bears might get mesothelioma, and I was like, I just don't think grizzly bears live for 40 years. They live a long time, but I'm not sure they're watching. Does that answer that? I think really they're not seeing it in pets because the latency period isn't long enough, is my...
Well, and I think, we've been so focused on human health that we kind of haven't taken that next step to really focus on those other issues.
Georgia's cutting me off. She's using the organizer's prerogative to make a comment.
Just a brief comment, because it is so true what Gay Beth said. We don't need dead fish to test the waters. And Dr. Davis had talked about the president, this was President Bush's panel that came out with a report this year on cancer prevention. And basically what they said is that we are toxic soups, that we have 85,000 chemicals, 200 have been tested, and that the babies that are being born nowadays are being born with an average of 250 chemicals. The cord blood analysis, most of them weren't even in the environment 50 or 100 years ago. So it's very difficult when we're looking at these equations that the EPA is talking about, show us how this one chemical causes this one disease in this one person, and then we'll have this conversation. And so this is something that clouded the water with the asbestos, and it's clouding the water with very, very many things. And we need to realize that very rarely can we look at this one particular toxic substance causing one disease in one person. And that is the standard they're holding us to right now. And so we really have to be brave, we have to be courageous to say, no, there's a lot of things we can't prove, but when we get enough evidence, the company had evidence back in the late 1970s that something was badly wrong. And I know all of you here on this panel did the very best you could. And as a physician, I know I'm missing a lot of stuff. And I don't want to miss it anymore. And I'm so grateful that you all are here to raise this awareness, because we are all living Libby right now. And I hope we can live it with your tenacity and your perseverance and your patience and your determinism. You've shared a great story that I'm better for hearing. So thank you so much.
Okay, I think we're ready. Are you all ready? So we have representatives from our afternoon focus sessions, and we're excited to hear some summary comments, inspirational comments, kind of the most important things you'd like to share from your time. If you all want to go, Kevin, you can start. Kevin, you want to start? Thanks.
So the breakout session that I led was on eco-despair. We talked about some of the feelings that emerge for us in the face of so much environmental degradation in the world. And I was really blessed to have a number of insightful, intelligent people participating in the breakout session. We had some wonderful comments to make. And we talked about how it's only natural to feel helplessness, grief, despair, anger, outrage, emotions like that, and faces some of the challenges in front of us. And one of the points that we talked about how these feelings are natural, and it's important to not get too caught up in the cultural narrative that we live in which we're taught largely to deny or avoid or numb negative emotions, and only focus on positive emotions and the power of positive thinking and those kinds of things. And some of the other points that came up are how to use the emotions in a way where we can act in a way that will benefit the environment. And one of the points that came up is how when we're able to show care for others, when we're able to focus on things outside of ourselves, as a general rule, we're happier when we do that. And people who thrive, who are resilient, and report high levels of joy and happiness in their lives are involved in causes outside their own skin. And then the question that came up at the very end was, okay, given the information that we have in identifying our core values around wanting to care for our environment, how do we go about translating that knowledge or that information into actual behavioral change? That's something I'm going to talk about in a few minutes after the other panelists highlight some of the things.
Was dealing with Missoula air quality. I'd like to say that over the last several decades, starting as far back as the 1960s, Missoula Valley and all the country actually has made huge strides in air quality. We used to regularly exceed the standards here in Missoula, and because of the Clean Air Acts of 1950s and 1970s and so forth, all the way through the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, industry has cleaned up a lot, automobiles have cleaned up their emissions a lot, and we're to the point now in time where the primary source of pollution actually isn't industrial sources or even the automobiles necessarily for particulate matter in the air. It is all of ourselves as individuals with our wood stoves, and again, back to the vehicles again, they are still a source of our pollution, but it's primarily from them, not industry. That was one of the high points that we had in our discussion. And then looking towards the future, where we're at is we're very close to the National Ambient Air Quality Standard for PM 2.5, the 24-hour standard. That's one that goes basically from midnight to midnight every day. We have had many values over 35, but so far we're skating underneath the standard because you're allowed to throw out a certain number of days each year. So into the future, where we're looking is continuing to require that wood stoves and small boilers that are installed throughout the county be the best available that that can be built or installed, and also promoting good practices for use of the wood stoves and boilers so that their emissions are kept low. And the plus side of that is if we continue to make improvements there and keep under the standards, we can continue to use wood as a source of heat and energy in western Montana. I mean, there's a lot of people who have interest in that because of the renewable aspects and its non-fossil fuel use. And so we hope to adopt regulations that will allow us to keep doing that and at the same time meet the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which are designed to protect public health. So far we're there in Missoula area, and hopefully we can continue to remain there.
Thanks, Ben. And my name is Chris Brick with the Clark Fork Coalition, and in our breakout session I discussed water quality in Missoula. And the takeaway, I guess, is that we're lucky. We have good, clean water in Missoula, and we want to keep it that way. Nonetheless, there are still threats to our drinking water supply, and among these threats are sewage. That includes both septic systems that impact the aquifer as well as discharge from the wastewater treatment plant that affects the river. And you know, that, of course, as you know, comes from all of us, and so consequently, I think all of us are responsible for making sure that the disposal systems are really the best they can be, whether it's our septic system or whether it's the wastewater treatment plant. There are other sources of potential contamination to groundwater, and those include fuel leaks, chemicals used in local industry, and also the chemicals that we use ourselves every day. We have a relatively good system, I think, of regulations that protect our water. We can always advocate for better. But more importantly, I think we can do our own part, really, to keep our water clean. Our challenge is to be good stewards of our water supply through everyday individual actions. We can think about the chemicals we use, we can use them sparingly or not at all, and we can dispose of them safely. In other words, think about what you're doing when you dump something down the drain. Think about where it goes. And that's the takeaway message, I guess.
I'm Erin Switowski with Women's Voices for the Earth, and our workshop was titled Green and Clean at Home. And the purpose of the workshop was to focus on things that we could do in our own home to make the home green and to reduce your toxic exposure from regular things that you find in your house. So we had a lot of conversation. We didn't get through all of the possible things you could do, the easy steps, and I've got some tips out on the table if anyone wants to grab one. But one of the things we talked about was making your own cleaning products. Some of you have probably heard that by now with simple ingredients like baking soda and vinegar. You can make an all-purpose spray, soft scrub, easy, really cheap, affordable things to do that will clean your home. And I'll just make a comment that I didn't make in the workshop, but if you do want to switch to your homemade products, don't just dump all your old ones down the drain, because we don't want to contaminate our waterways, but just use them up first. You could get rid of them. That's the best way, is just to use them slowly, and then switch over to making your own green cleaning products. And you can find recipes on our website at womensvoices.org. We talked about chemicals found in fragrance, and this is something that you'll find in your lotions, your laundry detergent, air fresheners. All these things is in a whole bunch of different synthetic chemicals mashed together to make up what's called a fragrance. So ridding your life of as many fragrances, those synthetic fragrances, as possible is a really easy way to kind of knock out some big sources of toxic chemicals. And instead you can bring fresh lavender into your home to have a nice smell, or focus more on just figuring out what's making the smell bad and get rid of it first. So those are some of the things we talked about. We also had a conversation around green products that are on the market, and the fact that the trouble is we don't really have a standard for what a green product is. So, while we can pretend like it's really easy to go out and just buy the green product, then we feel really good, we don't actually know if that is a safer and better choice. So we need to work on that and make sure that instead of just focusing on, buying things that are green and trying to shop our way out of the problem, we're looking at the problem as a whole and figuring out how to ensure that everything is safe and that everyone has access to green and clean products, whether it's marketed as green or not. And those products are generally more expensive and they're not available in all communities. So we just want across the board things to be green and clean. So we focused on that. And then finally, we talked about the need for that we can't solve this problem alone. We've heard this a lot today. Instead, we have to all chip in and figure out what the policy solutions are and make our voices heard. And next week, we'll be introducing a resolution into the Montana State Legislature. And this calls on our state legislature to basically it urges Congress to support federal reform of the Toxic Substances Control Act. So I'd urge everyone to send a message to your representative and senator in the Montana Congress and let them know that you support this.
Thank you. My name is Bonnie Buckingham. I'm with the Community Food and Agriculture Coalition, and our breakout session was on living greener on a budget. And to kind of echo what you just said, talked a little bit about if we truly want to address issues of global warming, climate change, greener living, we need to include all people, including those living in poverty. And so we talked a little bit about ways that we can come together, get informed, and oftentimes we think that green living is something that you can't really actually do on a budget, but in reality there are a lot of ways that it does actually save you money. And one of the ways is to meet your neighbors and share with them and share resources, buy things together, do projects together. Also, using a plethora of services that Missoula has. There are so many ways and so many different organizations that will provide resources such as Weave, MUD, CFAC, alternative transportation, organic foods, community gardens, and so if you can look on the internet, there are web resources out there that are organizations right here in Missoula. And then, as everyone has said, really networking, coming together as a community and reaching for longer term goals, moving away, well, not away, but as you're individually making changes in your lifestyle, also really looking to the longer term goals and changing the way we all live as a society. And I just want to thank St. Pat's for having us all here, because I think it really is a way to get informed and to take the first steps.
My name is Teresita Martinez. I'm a naturopathic physician in town, and Claire Emery and I co-presented on raising eco-wise youth, and my focus was on pregnancy, preconception and pregnancy. My focus had primarily to do with what's been discussed to date, just getting children or preparing yourself if you're a woman who's thinking about getting pregnant or a man who is thinking about having children, working toward eliminating potential toxins from your home, working toward eliminating toxins in the general environment. A lot of the food chain is contaminated, as we know, with all of the chemicals that have been used in the past 100 years. So the idea is really to work on getting yourself into a healthier state of being if you are looking to conceive children. And then while you're pregnant, really limiting the exposure that you have to environmental toxins, paying attention to just a few things. And I guess I will highlight some of those: not pumping gasoline, not remodeling your home, being conscious about your purchases. As has been discussed in the focus panels, toxic beauty, paying attention to the beauty products, things you put on your skin, paying attention to your air and water quality control. And it's not just about making sure that you're not breathing in those things, but acting to change legislation so that it is a healthier environment for your child to grow up. And then what we excel in is preventative medicine. So if you're looking to conceive, if you are pregnant, working with a physician that really has a focus on not expanding your exposure, because medications, procedures, they can all increase our exposure. So physicians that are tuned into how you can best work on your body's own eliminatory pathways are of increasing importance. Prevention is out there. It's a word we're all becoming familiar with or very familiar with, but it is so much about being informed, being mindful, and working toward preventing exposure. And Claire will take over the other half of that.
We had a good time in our group. I'm Claire Emery, and I'm not with any particular group, but I guess I'm with my own experience of being an environmental educator, an artist, and now a parent of young children. I'm interested in raising them to have, to be educated about the environment, to be connected with it, and to work for keeping it strong, safe, and in continuance. So what I focused on really wasn't so much the physical aspects of how do we make a healthy youth. Some of that, we've talked about that over and over at this conference, and we've got a lot of great ideas on that, I think, regarding foods and cleaning supplies and so on. I focused more on developing the children's wisdom and their wisdom about their home, their environment, and their ability, and strengthening their ability to make thoughtful and informed choices. So I kind of divided, in the handout I've got 10 action points that I hope you'll look at even if you weren't at our session. And what I did is I divided that into sort of 3 groups, and the first one was, I think it's very important that we help our children develop an attachment to nature, or to the sense of the larger community in terms of it being their home. Their home's not just a building, not just blood relatives, but it's the larger human and other than human communities that we're a part of. So under that heading, I encourage parents, educators to model respect and care for nature, to bring children outdoors from the earliest moment and let them have unstructured immersion in nature, and then make outdoor activities just be a part of family life. If they aren't already, there are 1,000 things we can do in Missoula, Montana, to spend more time, meaningful time outdoors, whether it's playing, working, or doing service projects. I also encourage people to unplug from the media, make your home eco-friendly, and to connect with like-minded families and organizations so that together you can build momentum together to make it fun, make it meaningful, and really, just get energy for the work ahead. And then my last 2 points were I encourage people to strengthen children's understanding of, their self-knowledge, but also their understanding of how nature works and why it's important, and what they can do to protect it, care for it, work with it. So I mentioned getting involved with the culture of nature instead of being plugged into just TV or media blindly. Make really good choices about what movies, what books, what articles, what music you're connecting with, and then have conversations about that. I've had amazing things happen with different book clubs, and my children have been involved in book clubs since first grade. So it's like, don't wait until you're an adult to have a book club. Children love this, and there's so many great books out there that you can read and use as a springboard to discuss environmental and conservation issues, health, healing, wholeness, all these things. And then I encourage people to get involved with some of the myriad organizations in Missoula that are conservation-minded, environmental, gardening, they're nature organizations. There's so many ways. We have an embarrassment of riches in Missoula as far as ways we can plug in, volunteer, and get involved in making the world a better place. So I guess I'll I guess I have to say one more thing. I've said a lot, but the last piece was, it's very important to empower children to take action instead of overwhelming them with, this despair you talked about. I was paralyzed for years as a child with despair about the environment because it wasn't presented to me in a way where I could do anything about it. So my third point was really about empowering children to come up with their own creative, meaningful, and tangible hands-on projects that they can do to respond to the things that are going on in our world with the environment. Thank you.
And
Can we have some questions of the panelists? Can we?
sure. Go ahead, Georgia.
I had a question because it sounds like, what you were saying, that the air quality is not so bad. Is that kind of the...
A little bit subjective term, but yeah. What I'm speaking specifically of today is the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, where we stand relative to that. There are going to be individuals who are affected by air quality at far less concentrations than where a standard is set at. The Clean Air Act specifies clearly that a standard is set to protect sensitive groups. Sensitive groups are categories of people, someone who is asthmatic, people with coronary issues. Those are sensitive groups. That is where the standard is set at. There are always going to be individuals who are what we tend to call hypersensitive. And unfortunately, the standard is not set to protect them. And it's a little bit impossible sometimes because there are such things as allergies and things that are just naturally occurring that some of us react to. And so it's a fuzzy point of view. I guess my biggest take-home message would be for air quality is we've made huge improvements in Missoula and nationally and many other places in the country over the last several decades. It's been a huge success story. But at the same time, we are clearly still having air quality issues that can impact people in western Montana. The most clear thing that's affecting people's health would be the smoke throughout all of our western valleys in the state, which are causing us to either get really close to the standard or exceed that standard. So the answer is basically yes, we have good air, but we still have some progress to be made, especially as population continues to grow and people start to rely more and more on wood devices for heating and energy.
It made me think because one, I think as a healthcare provider with that, when we have these inversion days for sure, that if the county was really requiring or at least highly suggesting that healthcare providers say to our patients, don't drive your car so much. I mean, it's amazing how people will listen to healthcare providers, but that information isn't given. Because we do see so much more bronchitis, asthma, COPD, all of these problems, and we could use your wood stove less, because a lot of people, that's not their primary source of heat, or stop driving so much. I mean, even just those very simple things I think would help. And I know one thing that they're doing in Arkansas is that the state, actually it's Clinton's foundation that's starting the funding for it, but for anyone who's employed by the state, people go in and they can have clean energy in their home, and so this decreases fossil fuels. And it's interesting, so people can have green homes, but the state will pay for that up front. And then the people pay back the state by what their cost savings is, the cost savings for their energy bill that month. So they're paying back like $50 or $75 a month, where they're getting a huge value to their home, and they're not spending anything out of pocket. And yet the state is getting it back, and they're finding out that they have even cleaner air, cleaner waters, all of these other things. And I guess I'm just mentioning it because the air has improved so much, but it seems like we have so far to go, especially with the inversion days. And certainly as a healthcare provider, I'm not doing enough. So I'm grateful for what you're doing, and make me do more.
Yeah, and the city actually has a green blocks program and some other things that are of the type that you're talking about that we don't have time to go into great detail today. But it's also true around Christmas times, we actually did exceed the daily standard, the CUTE standard. I can't remember if it was 4 or 5 days. So yeah, we do have ways to go, but at the same time, we'd like to acknowledge Missoula urban area, the residents that live here have done a tremendous effort over the decades. They've sacrificed being able to use wood stoves, just going out and throwing and putting wood into a a stove and using that for heat. That is something we have had to give up so that all of us could benefit from a health perspective. And so we just like to acknowledge that when we can.
Thank you all very much. Nice job, all of the focus sessions.